Guests sleep inside. You can take the garage, my mother-in-law said to me every Thanksgiving. She handed me a deflated air mattress and locked the door to the heated house. This year, a high-end realtor knocked on her mahogany front door, carrying a stack of federal documents. "Excuse me, ma'am," the realtor said, stepping past her. "The new owner would like to walk through her property before we initiate the eviction." My mother-in-law's smug smile vanished the second she saw me standing on the porch holding the deed. "My name is Harper Quinn. I am 31 years old, and I appraise distressed commercial real estate for a living. Before I tell you how a freezing night in a storage space handed me the keys to a multimillion-dollar estate, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not inherited." The November wind cut through the thin walls of the Sterling family garage. I dropped my canvas duffel bag onto the concrete floor. My breath formed small white clouds in the dim light. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, stood in the doorway, leading back into the sprawling, custom-built kitchen. The warmth from the house spilled out, smelling of roasted turkey and expensive sage candles. "Our relatives flew in from out of state, and they require the guest suites," Beatrice said. She smoothed the front of her cashmere cardigan. "You will manage out here. A girl raised in the state foster system should be accustomed to drafts." She did not wait for an answer. She reached for the brass handle. My husband Julian stood just behind her shoulder holding a glass of Pinot Noir. He wore a tailored sweater and a sheepish expression. He looked at the concrete floor, then at his shoes, refusing to meet my eyes. He murmured a quiet goodnight and stepped back into the glowing warmth of his parents' home. Beatrice pulled the heavy door shut. The deadbolt clicked into place. I stood alone in the dark. I did not shed a tear. Crying requires an expectation of comfort, and I had learned long ago to expect nothing from the Sterling family. I pulled out my phone and activated the flashlight, sweeping the beam across the cluttered space to find a wall outlet for my portable heater. Near the back wall, hidden beneath a dust-covered billiards table, the light caught the edge of a plastic storage bin. My boot bumped against it. The lid sat askew, revealing stacks of manila folders rather than holiday decorations. I knelt on the freezing concrete and pulled the top folder free. The bold red lettering on the first envelope caught my attention immediately. Notice of default. I opened the envelope. I pulled out a letter from a major national bank. It detailed a 90-day delinquency on the primary mortgage of the very estate I was sleeping under. I dug deeper into the bin. I found a second warning from a different lender, then a third. Tax liens from the State Revenue Service sat paper-clipped to credit card statements showing maximized limits. Richard and Beatrice Sterling, the untouchable elites of their social circle, were drowning in $4 million of toxic debt. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the catered dinners, it was a hollow stage play funded by loans they could no longer pay. But their financial ruin was not the discovery that made my blood run cold. At the bottom of the bin rested a pristine heavy-duty folder marked with the logo of Chase Bank. I opened it. It was an approved commercial loan application for $500,000. The primary borrower listed was Julian Sterling. I scanned the pages, reading the fine print outlining the collateral requirements. Julian did not have the credit score to secure $500,000. My eyes landed on the guarantor section. My name, Harper Quinn, sat neatly printed in the designated box, leveraging my flawless 800 credit score and my independent assets to secure the funds. Right below my printed name rested a signature. The loops and sharp angles mimicked my handwriting with chilling precision. Julian had not just abandoned me in a freezing garage to appease his mother. He had forged my identity to absorb his family's catastrophic debt. If the Sterlings defaulted on this loan, the bank would not seize their over-leveraged mansion. They would seize my salary, my savings, and my freedom. I was looking at federal bank fraud, and I was the designated scapegoat. I folded the loan application, slipped it into the inner pocket of my winter coat, and sat down on the uninflated air mattress. The cold seeping through the floor no longer bothered me. I had 7 hours until the sun came up, and I needed every minute to plan exactly how I would tear their hollow empire to the ground. I spent the night wrapped in my coat, staring at the concrete ceiling of the garage, replaying Julian's betrayal in my mind. When the morning light finally crept under the garage door, I slid the forged loan document into my leather tote bag and smoothed my clothes. I waited until I heard the muffled sounds of the family gathering before turning the deadbolt and stepping into the warm kitchen. The Thanksgiving breakfast was an elaborate display of wealth. Silver platters held pastries and fresh fruit. Julian stood near the coffee maker, playing the role of the devoted, attentive husband. He smiled brightly as I entered, pouring a cup of coffee and bringing it to me in front of his visiting aunts and uncles. "Good morning, honey," Julian said, his voice dripping with practiced affection. "I hope you slept well." I took the mug. I did not take a sip. I looked directly into his eyes, cutting through his performance. "We need to discuss the Chase Bank commercial loan," Julian, I stated, keeping my voice level pitched, just loud enough for the table to hear the name of the bank, but not the context. "The $500,000 disbursement." The color drained from Julian's face instantly. His cheerful smile vanished, replaced by a sudden rigid panic. He glanced nervously at his parents, who were suddenly very interested in their breakfast plates. He grabbed my elbow, his grip tight and frantic. "Let us wash our hands before we eat," he muttered, dragging me forcefully down the hallway and pushing me into the downstairs guest bathroom. He locked the heavy wooden door behind us. The false sweetness evaporated, leaving behind the cowardly, desperate man he truly was. He crowded me against the marble vanity, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me. "Where did you find that paperwork, Harper?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a harsh, panicked whisper. "You had no right snooping through my parents' things." "You forged my signature on a federal banking document," I replied, staring back at him without a flinch. "You committed felony identity theft to secure capital you do not have." Julian let out a sharp, dismissive scoff. "Do not be dramatic. It is just a temporary bridge loan to help my father cover some operational costs for his company. We will pay it back before the end of the quarter. You are my wife. We are supposed to act as a team. You should be willing to make sacrifices for this family." He attempted to weaponize my marriage vows to excuse a federal crime. I reached into my bag and pulled out the document, tapping my finger against the forged signature. "This is not a sacrifice," I said. "This is a prison sentence waiting to happen, and you set me up to take the fall." Julian stepped closer, invading my personal space, his face turning ugly with desperation. "Listen to me very carefully, Harper. If you go to the bank, if you breathe a word of this to the police, I will tell them you orchestrated the entire transfer. I will tell them you used your expertise in distressed debt to funnel the cash into a private account. You grew up in the system. You have no family to vouch for you. The police will look at a wealthy, established businessman and a foster kid with a grudge, and they will know exactly who to believe." He delivered the threat with chilling confidence. He believed my lack of a bloodline made me an easy target. He believed his family's social standing would act as an impenetrable shield. I looked at him, absorbing the sheer magnitude of his betrayal. I did not argue. I did not scream. I slid the document back into my bag and pushed past him, unlocking the bathroom door. I walked out of the house, leaving my overnight bag in the garage, and got into my car. I did not drive to the police station. Julian was right about one thing. A prominent family facing financial ruin would use their last dollars to hire aggressive defense attorneys who would gleefully paint me as the mastermind. I needed legal shielding, and I needed an insider who understood the Sterling family's financial architecture. I drove 20 miles to a quiet, independent coffee shop on the outskirts of the city. I ordered a black coffee and pulled out my phone. I dialed a number I rarely used. Marcus answered on the second ring. Marcus Hayes was married to Caroline, Julian's younger sister, and the undisputed golden child of the Sterling family. He was a highly successful corporate tax attorney, a brilliant black man who observed the Sterling family's casual racism and financial arrogance with quiet, analytical disdain. He maintained a polite distance from their drama, choosing to engage only when strictly necessary. I told Marcus I had discovered a significant irregularity in Richard's corporate filings and requested an immediate meeting. He agreed to meet me at the coffee shop within the hour. Marcus arrived wearing a tailored casual suit, his expression neutral. He slid into the booth across from me, ordering an espresso. "What did you find?" Harper, Marcus asked, his tone strictly professional. I did not offer preamble. I handed him the forged loan document. Marcus retrieved a pair of reading glasses from his breast pocket and scanned the pages. His eyes, usually calm and detached, narrowed sharply. He flipped to the secondary collateral agreements attached to the back of the file, his finger tracing the lines of text. He set the document down and removed his glasses, looking at me with a grim, serious expression. "This is not a simple bridge loan to cover operational costs," Marcus stated, his voice low and precise. "I audited Richard's holdings last year when he asked me for a tax favor. The man is drowning. He has leveraged every asset he owns to maintain his country club lifestyle." Marcus tapped the paperwork. "This loan is a cross-collateralization trap. Julian did not just secure $500,000. He structured the debt so that your personal credit profile and any assets held in your name act as the primary guarantee against Richard's entire portfolio of failing commercial mortgages." I felt the blood drain from my face. Julian had not just stolen my signature, he had chained me to a sinking ship. If Richard defaults, Marcus continued, leaning forward, the banks will not initiate foreclosure on the Sterling estate first. That process takes months and involves expensive litigation. They will execute the guarantor clause. They will seize your bank accounts, garnish your wages, and liquidate any property you own to satisfy the immediate debt. And because your signature is on the origination file, if you attempt to declare bankruptcy to stop them, the federal investigators will indict you for bank fraud. He leaned back, his gaze calculating. Julian handed you a loaded gun, pointed it at your head, and tied the trigger to his father's failing business. I sat back in the booth, absorbing the catastrophic reality of my situation. I was legally responsible for $4 million of toxic debt generated by people who forced me to sleep on a concrete floor. "What is my move, Marcus?" I asked, needing a strategic path out of the crosshairs. "We cannot challenge the forgery right now," Marcus advised, slipping into tactical mode. "A fraud investigation will take months, during which the bank will freeze your assets. We need to detach you from the liability before the default occurs. You work in commercial asset recovery, Harper. You know how these banks operate when a loan turns toxic." I looked at the document resting on the table. The gears in my mind began to turn, analyzing the problem not as a betrayed wife, but as a specialist in distressed debt acquisition. The bank holding the loan was notorious for offloading high-risk portfolios to private equity firms at a steep discount to clear their books. "I do not need to detach myself from the liability," I realized aloud, a cold, sharp plan forming in my mind. "I need to become the liability holder." Marcus raised an eyebrow, a slow, appreciative smile touching the corners of his mouth. He recognized the strategy instantly. He knew exactly what kind of war I was preparing to wage. "I need you to run a silent query on Richard's primary lenders," I told him, sliding the document back into my bag. "I need to know the exact date the banks plan to bundle his debt for a secondary market sale. I can acquire that information by tomorrow morning," Marcus confirmed, standing up from the booth. "But you understand the capital required to purchase a distressed portfolio of this magnitude. You will need millions in liquid backing." I stood up, matching his resolute gaze. "I have spent my entire career recovering assets for ruthless private equity firms, Marcus. I know exactly who to call for funding. Julian thought he was using my identity to steal $500,000. I am going to use my identity to buy his entire family." The moment I left the coffee shop, I knew the clock was ticking. Marcus's confirmation of the cross-collateralization meant Julian and Richard were not just reckless. They were actively managing their collapse. They needed my signature to hold the structure together. When I failed to return to the estate that evening, they realized I was not going to quietly accept the role of the sacrificial lamb. The retaliation began the next morning, and it did not start with a phone call. It started with a coordinated social execution. Beatrice Sterling, a woman whose entire existence was predicated on maintaining her position within the elite suburban hierarchy, utilized her primary weapon, the country club luncheon. She reserved the private dining room at the Oak Ridge Country Club, charging the exorbitant catering fee to one of the few credit cards Richard still managed to keep active. She invited 15 prominent women from her social circle. I learned the details of this gathering later from an appalled colleague whose mother happened to be in attendance. Beatrice did not serve tea and scones. She served a meticulously crafted narrative of victimhood. She sat at the head of the table, dabbing her eyes with a linen napkin, and informed the ladies that her son's marriage was dissolving under tragic circumstances. She claimed that I had been diagnosed with severe bipolar disorder. She fabricated a story detailing my erratic behavior, stating that I was suffering from paranoid delusions regarding the family's finances. The lies grew more vicious. Beatrice told the group that I was systematically siphoning money from Julian's personal accounts to fund illicit charities and support unvetted individuals from the foster care system I grew up in. She painted me as an unstable, manipulative opportunist who was attempting to drain the Sterling family wealth to compensate for my own traumatic childhood. She did not just isolate me. She weaponized my background, turning my history in the foster system into proof of my inherent instability. Julian executed the tactical phase of the attack, while his mother handled the public relations. I was sitting in my office reviewing a portfolio of distressed commercial assets when my cell phone vibrated. A notification from my banking app flashed across the screen. My joint checking account with Julian, the account I used to pay my personal expenses and manage my daily life, had been frozen. I logged into the portal. The balance read 0. Julian had withdrawn the funds and removed my authorization access. I grabbed my keys and drove directly to the suburban townhouse we shared. I intended to pack my remaining belongings and secure my physical documents. I pulled into the driveway and approached the front door. The electronic keypad, which I used every day for the past 3 years, flashed a bright red error message when I entered my PIN. Access denied. Julian had changed the security codes. I stood on the porch staring at the locked door. I was effectively homeless and locked out of my own finances in a matter of hours. He had executed a perfect clinical lockout. My phone rang. It was my managing director at the asset recovery firm, a stern, pragmatic man named David. "Harper, I need you in my office immediately," David said, his voice stripped of its usual collegial tone. I drove back to the city, the knot of anxiety in my chest tightening with every mile. I walked into David's office to find him staring at a printed document resting on his desk. "We received an anonymous email this morning." David began sliding the paper across the polished wood. It was sent to the executive board and the compliance division. I picked up the document. The email was heavily detailed, alleging that I was utilizing my position within the firm to execute unauthorized fraudulent trades. It claimed I was manipulating distressed debt portfolios to funnel kickbacks into private offshore accounts. The language was sophisticated, utilizing correct financial terminology to make the accusations sound credible. Julian and Richard were not just trying to force me out of the family. They were attempting to annihilate my career. If my firm launched a formal investigation based on these allegations, I would be suspended, my professional reputation ruined, and my ability to secure future employment in the financial sector destroyed. David watched me read the email. "The board requires a formal response," he stated grimly. "Until we complete a full internal audit of your recent acquisitions, I have to place you on administrative leave. You are locked out of the trading floor effective immediately." They had successfully severed my income, my housing, and my professional standing in a single afternoon. They expected the crushing weight of total isolation to force my surrender. They assumed that a woman raised in the system, possessing no family safety net, would inevitably break and return to them, willing to sign any document to regain a semblance of stability. I handed the paper back to David. "I will cooperate fully with the audit," I replied, maintaining a calm, unreadable expression. "I assure you my acquisitions are spotless." I walked out of the building carrying a single cardboard box containing the contents of my desk. I placed the box in the trunk of my car and sat in the driver's seat. I had a few $100s in cash and my personal independent savings account, which Julian could not access. It was enough for a cheap motel room and a burner phone. I needed to act decisively, but I was flying blind regarding Richard's next move. The burner phone rang the next morning. It was Marcus. "We have a massive problem, Harper," Marcus said, dispensing with any greeting. "Richard is panicking. He knows the banks are preparing to bundle his toxic debt for the secondary market. If that happens, he loses control of the narrative and the foreclosure process initiates." I sat on the edge of the sagging motel bed, gripping the phone. What is his play? "He is negotiating a private debt transfer with a shadow syndicate operating out of Chicago," Marcus revealed, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "These are not regulated bankers, Harper. They are predatory lenders who specialize in hostile asset seizure. Richard is attempting to sell his own debt to them at a discount to secure a brief extension on the foreclosure." I closed my eyes, absorbing the terrifying reality of Richard's desperation. He was inviting sharks into the water to avoid drowning. But here is the critical part. Marcus continued the urgency escalating. He is structuring the transfer agreement to list your forged signature as the primary guarantor on the new consolidated debt package. He intends to use the fabricated mental health narrative and the anonymous corporate complaints to convince these lenders that you are a rogue, unstable operator who absconded with his funds. He is setting you up to be the sole target when the syndicate comes collecting. The strategy was brutally effective. Richard would hand my forged signature to a group of men who did not care about legal due process. They would employ intimidation, harassment, and potentially violence to extract the funds from the named guarantor. I had 48 hours before the transfer finalized. If Richard signed that agreement, I would spend the rest of my life running from debt collectors who operated outside the law. I hung up the phone. I looked around the dingy motel room. They had stripped me of my home, my husband, and my job. They assumed a girl from the foster system would curl up and disappear when the pressure became intolerable. They forgot that a girl from the foster system knows how to survive when the world burns down around her. I opened my laptop and began drafting the counteroffensive. I was going to buy the fire. The neon sign outside the motel window flickered, casting a sickly pink hue across the cheap veneer desk where I set up my command center. I did not waste time mourning the life Julian and his family had violently dismantled. I compartmentalized the betrayal, shoving the emotional wreckage into a locked box in my mind. I was no longer a discarded wife. I was a distressed debt investor facing a hostile takeover, and I needed to maneuver with clinical predatory precision. I needed an untraceable corporate entity. I opened a secure browser and navigated the bureaucratic labyrinth of Wyoming business registration. Wyoming possesses some of the strongest corporate privacy laws in the country, allowing the creation of anonymous limited liability companies. Within 2 hours, Vanguard Holdings LLC was officially incorporated. The registered agent was a faceless post office box in Cheyenne. My name appeared nowhere on the public filings. The legal architecture was established, but acquiring $4 million of toxic debt required significant capital. My independent savings account held $95,000, a respectable sum, but woefully inadequate for a multimillion-dollar buyout. I needed external funding, and I needed it from individuals who operated with the same ruthless efficiency I was about to employ. I began making phone calls. I reached out to 3 aggressive private equity managers I had collaborated with over the past 7 years. I had previously recovered millions in defaulted assets for these men, navigating complex commercial foreclosures that other analysts deemed unsalvageable. I possessed immense credibility within their network. I pitched the proposition not as a vendetta, but as a highly lucrative distressed asset acquisition. I presented Richard Sterling's portfolio, the heavily leveraged Beacon Hill estate, the luxury vehicles, the failing commercial properties. I explained that the current debt holder, a regional bank eager to clean its balance sheet before the fiscal quarter ended, was preparing to sell the debt package at a steep discount to a shadow syndicate in Chicago. I proposed that Vanguard Holdings step in, purchase the debt at 30 cents on the dollar, and execute a swift, profitable liquidation of the Sterling assets. The equity managers recognized the mathematical certainty of the return. They wired the required capital into Vanguard Holdings' newly established corporate account within 24 hours. I was fully funded. The tactical execution required absolute secrecy. I could not approach the bank directly. Richard still maintained connections within the local financial sector, and any rumor of an aggressive buyer would trigger his paranoia. I needed a proxy. I called Marcus on the burner phone. I need you to facilitate a blind transaction, I instructed, detailing the parameters of the operation. Vanguard Holdings is prepared to purchase the entirety of Richard and Julian's outstanding debt portfolio. I need you to act as the intermediary broker between the bank and my LLC. Ensure the bank understands this is a cash offer, demanding immediate closure before the Chicago syndicate finalizes their paperwork. Marcus, recognizing the brilliance of the maneuver, agreed without hesitation. He utilized his credentials as an independent corporate tax attorney to approach the bank on behalf of an anonymous investment group. The bank, desperate to offload the toxic Sterling portfolio and avoid a protracted foreclosure battle, leaped at the guaranteed cash offer. The negotiation concluded in a matter of hours. The paperwork was expedited, the signatures digitized, and the massive wire transfer from Vanguard Holdings cleared the banking system by Friday afternoon. I sat in the dim motel room watching the confirmation email materialize in my inbox. The transaction was final. The bank officially relinquished all claims to the Sterling family debt. The Chicago syndicate was permanently locked out. Vanguard Holdings, LLC, was now the sole undisputed owner of the $4 million debt portfolio. I held the primary lien on the Beacon Hill mansion. I held the titles to the luxury vehicles. I held the commercial paper that Richard had desperately tried to shield. I owned their entire financial existence. I downloaded the digital deed transfers and the finalized assignment of debt contracts onto a heavily encrypted USB drive. I held the small piece of metal in the palm of my hand. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the shockwave had not even registered with the targets yet. Richard and Beatrice believed they had successfully navigated the crisis. They assumed the bank had sold the debt to a faceless corporate entity that would allow them time to negotiate a structured repayment plan. They thought they had sacrificed me to secure their own survival. They had no idea they had just handed the keys to their kingdom directly to the woman they forced to sleep in their garage. I placed the USB drive on the desk. The preparation phase was complete. I possessed the legal authority to seize their home, liquidate their assets, and initiate criminal proceedings against Julian for the forged commercial loan. I could execute the foreclosure tomorrow and throw them onto the street by the end of the week. But a quiet, calculated realization settled over me. Evicting them on a random Tuesday lacked the necessary psychological impact. A private foreclosure would allow Beatrice to spin a narrative to play the tragic victim of a cruel banking system. I needed an audience. I needed the execution to be public, undeniable, and utterly humiliating. I needed to wait for the perfect stage. I secured a modest, short-term apartment under a pseudonym, continuing to operate Vanguard Holdings from the shadows. I watched from afar as the seasons changed. I observed Harper's social media, noting the desperate, strained attempts to maintain the illusion of wealth. I monitored Richard's failing business ventures. They were living on borrowed time, dancing on a minefield they could not see. A year passed. The air turned crisp, signaling the approach of November. My burner phone chimed with an incoming text message. The sender was Beatrice Sterling. Harper, the message read, dripping with manufactured condescension. The family is gathering for Thanksgiving dinner at the estate. Julian mentioned you might be struggling. We are willing to extend an olive branch and allow you to join us, provided you are prepared to apologize for your past behavior and demonstrate some gratitude. I stared at the glowing screen. The sheer staggering arrogance of the invitation was breathtaking. After stealing my identity, orchestrating a smear campaign, and destroying my career, Beatrice believed she was offering me a profound mercy by allowing me back into their orbit. She believed hunger and isolation had broken me. She believed I was ready to crawl back and beg for the privilege of sleeping in their garage. I did not delete the message. I typed a brief, submissive reply. Thank you, Beatrice. I will be there. I locked the phone and picked up the encrypted USB drive. The waiting period was over. The trap was set, and the prey had just sent me an invitation to the slaughter. The drive to the Sterling estate felt entirely different this year. The crisp November air carried the scent of wood smoke and decaying leaves, a sharp contrast to the suffocating panic that had gripped me 12 months prior. I did not grip the steering wheel with white knuckles. I drove with the relaxed, effortless posture of a predator circling a tethered kill. I parked my modest sedan on the street, leaving the sweeping circular driveway clear for the luxury vehicles of the visiting relatives. I walked up the cobblestone path wearing a simple, muted gray wool dress. I carried a small canvas overnight bag, carefully curating the image of a defeated woman arriving with nothing but the clothes on her back. Beatrice opened the heavy mahogany door before I even reached the porch. She wore a tailored burgundy dress, a string of heavy pearls resting against her collarbone. She looked me up and down, her expression, a masterclass in performative pity masking, deep-seated contempt. Harper Beatrice sighed, adopting the tone of a disappointed sovereign greeting a rebellious peasant. I see the year away has not improved your circumstances. Come inside. Do not track mud onto the foyer rug. I stepped into the house. The interior was a chaotic symphony of wealth and entitlement. The scent of roasted turkey and expensive wine mingled in the warm air. Extended family members clad in designer autumnal wear mingled in the expansive living room, holding crystal flutes filled with champagne. Julian leaned against the marble fireplace mantel, engaged in conversation with an uncle. He caught sight of me entering the hallway. The smug, victorious smirk that spread across his face was almost comical in its predictability. He believed his brutal tactics had worked. He assumed the threat of financial ruin and social exile had successfully broken my spirit, forcing me to return and accept my designated place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. Caroline, Julian's younger sister, intercepted me near the dining room entrance. She was the family's golden child, a woman who treated life as an endless sponsored vacation. She held up her hand ostentatiously, showcasing a heavy diamond tennis bracelet that caught the chandelier light. "Do you like it?" Caroline asked, her voice bright and vapid. "Marcus bought it for me for our anniversary. It is nice to see you, Harper. I hope you brought a warmer coat this year." Before I could respond, Beatrice appeared beside her daughter, placing a proprietary hand on Caroline's shoulder. "Let us be clear regarding the sleeping arrangements," Beatrice announced, ensuring her voice carried just enough for Julian and several nearby guests to hear. "We have important out-of-town guests occupying the main suites. The house is entirely full. You know the rules, Harper. Guests sleep inside. You can take the garage." She pointed toward the heavy wooden door leading to the attached storage space. The gesture was identical to the one she had made a year ago, a deliberate, calculated humiliation designed to reestablish my subordinate status. Julian watched from the fireplace, his smirk widening. He raised his champagne glass slightly, offering a silent, mocking toast to my subjugation. I looked at Beatrice's outstretched hand, then at Julian's arrogant face. I did not argue. I did not defend my dignity. I offered a small, compliant nod. "Of course, Beatrice," I replied, keeping my voice quiet and submissive. "I understand completely." I gripped the handle of my canvas bag, turned away from the warmth of the gathering, and walked directly toward the garage door. I stepped into the dark, frigid space, the heavy door clicking shut behind me, sealing out the noise of their celebration. Through the thin walls, I could hear the immediate eruption of laughter. "Did you see her face?" Julian chuckled, his voice filtering clearly through the drywall. "She looks like a whipped dog. I told you cutting her off would force her to fall in line. She needs to learn respect." Beatrice added, her tone ringing with self-satisfaction. "Allowing her back into the house is a generosity she hardly deserves. She will sleep in the cold until she learns her place." I stood in the dark garage, listening to them congratulate themselves on my perceived surrender. I did not unroll a sleeping bag. I did not search for a space heater. I simply leaned against the concrete wall, checking the digital clock on my phone. The execution was scheduled to begin in exactly 45 minutes. I had ample time to wait. The muffled sounds of the gathering eventually shifted toward the formal dining room. The clinking of silverware and the scrape of heavy wooden chairs indicated the guests were taking their seats for the main event. I unlocked the garage door and slipped quietly back into the house. I did not join them at the table. I remained standing in the shadowed hallway, positioned perfectly to observe the dining room without being seen. The table was an opulent display of excess groaning under the weight of expensive dishes and floral centerpieces. Richard sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, radiating the authority he believed he still commanded. Beatrice sat at the opposite end, smiling graciously at her assembled guests. Julian and Caroline flanked their father, the picture-perfect heirs to a thriving dynasty. Richard tapped a silver spoon against his crystal wine glass. The conversations around the table ceased immediately. All eyes turned toward the patriarch. "Family." Richard began, his booming baritone filling the room. He raised his glass, preparing to deliver the customary Thanksgiving address. This year has presented its challenges, but the sterling legacy remains unbroken. We stand together united by our shared values, our unwavering commitment to excellence, and our enduring prosperity. He looked around the table, making eye contact with his siblings and business associates, ensuring they absorbed the image of his unshakable success. "We have weathered storms that would have broken lesser families." Richard continued, his voice swelling with manufactured pride. "But we emerged stronger. We are a testament to the power of resilience and the strength of our heritage. Let us raise a glass to the Sterling family, to our continued wealth, and to the unyielding foundation we have built together." The guests raised their glasses in unison, murmuring their agreements, ready to drink to the illusion Richard had so carefully constructed. Just as the crystal rims touched their lips, a sharp, piercing sound shattered the solemn atmosphere. The front doorbell rang. The sudden noise was jarring, an abrasive intrusion, slicing directly through Richard's grand finale. The glasses paused mid-air. The guests exchanged confused glances. Richard frowned, lowering his glass, his expression tightening with annoyance at the interruption. "Who on earth is arriving at this hour?" he muttered, gesturing impatiently to Julian. "Go see who is at the door and get rid of them. We are in the middle of dinner." Julian rolled his eyes, setting his napkin on the table. He stood up, muttering under his breath about aggressive salespeople, and walked out of the dining room toward the grand foyer. I remained hidden in the hallway shadow, my pulse remaining perfectly steady. I did not need to guess who was standing on the porch. I knew exactly who it was, and I knew she was not selling anything. The reckoning had arrived, dressed in a sharp gray suit and carrying a leather portfolio. Julian pulled open the heavy double doors with a sharp, irritated yank. I watched from the shadows of the hallway as the porch light illuminated the visitor. Standing on the threshold was a tall, sharply dressed woman wearing a slate gray suit. She carried a thick leather portfolio tucked under one arm. A discreet, polished name badge clipped to her lapel identified her as a senior agent for a premier commercial real estate brokerage firm based in Manhattan. She did not look like a woman who had arrived at the wrong address. She looked like a woman executing a high-value transaction. Julian leaned against the doorframe, projecting an aura of entitled annoyance. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "We are in the middle of a private family dinner. We are not interested in buying whatever you are selling." The real estate agent did not flinch at his rudeness. She offered a brief, impeccably professional smile that contained absolutely zero warmth. "I apologize for the interruption during your holiday meal," she stated, her voice projecting clearly the acoustics of the grand foyer, carrying her words directly into the silent dining room. However, the new owner of this property requested a preliminary walkthrough this evening to assess the physical condition of the primary structure before we initiate the final site clearance procedures next week. The silence that fell over the dining room was immediate and absolute. The clinking of silverware stopped. The muted conversations died instantly. In the foyer, Julian stared at the agent, his arrogant smirk freezing on his face. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, confusion replacing his annoyance. "New owner site clearance. You have the wrong house, lady. This estate belongs to my family." Richard's heavy footsteps echoed from the dining room as he marched into the foyer, his face flushed with sudden aggressive anger. He pushed past Julian, confronting the agent directly. "Are you out of your mind?" Richard roared, attempting to physically intimidate the woman with his sheer volume. "I am Richard Sterling. This is my home. You are trespassing on private property. Get off my porch right now, or I will have the police arrest you for harassment." The agent did not step back. She did not look intimidated. She maintained her calm, clinical demeanor, the posture of a professional accustomed to dealing with hostile evictions. "Mr. Sterling," the agent replied, her voice remaining perfectly level. "The public county records indicate that this property underwent a formal foreclosure proceeding and was subsequently purchased at a federal liquidation auction 30 days ago. You are currently occupying an asset owned by a private holdings company. If you wish to involve law enforcement, I am legally obligated to present the eviction notices to the responding officers." Beatrice appeared in the dining room doorway, her face drained of color. The elegant hostess persona shattered completely. She clutched her pearl necklace, her eyes darting frantically between Richard and the impassive real estate agent. "Richard, what is she saying?" Beatrice gasped, her voice shrill with rising panic. "What foreclosure? You told me you refinanced the mortgage. You told me the bank extended the credit lines." Richard ignored his wife. He pointed a trembling finger at the agent. "This is a scam," he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain of his collapsing reality. "You are running a fraudulent shakedown. I demand to speak to the buyer. I demand to see the documentation proving this ridiculous claim." The agent finally took a single step backward, moving smoothly out of the direct line of sight from the doorway. "That can be arranged," the agent said, gesturing toward the shadowed hallway where I stood waiting. "The owner is present and carries the necessary documentation." I stepped out of the shadows. I did not carry a deflated air mattress. I did not wear the posture of a defeated, submissive woman banished to a freezing garage. I walked into the foyer with slow, deliberate steps, holding a thick-bound legal folder marked with the heavy crimson seal of the federal bankruptcy court. I stopped beside the real estate agent, locking eyes with Richard. Beatrice let out a sharp, horrified gasp. Julian staggered backward, hitting the wall, his eyes wide with a terror he could no longer conceal. "I believe you requested to see the paperwork," Richard restated, my voice echoing clearly in the stunned silence of the grand foyer. I walked past them, stepping confidently into the dining room. The extended family members sat frozen in their chairs, staring at me in total shock. I walked directly to the head of the table, standing in the exact spot Richard had occupied moments ago during his boastful Thanksgiving toast. I slammed the federal document down onto the center of the mahogany table, directly over the centerpiece. The heavy folder hit the wood with a loud, definitive smack. "I suggest you review the title deed attached to the front page," I announced to the silent room. Richard rushed back into the dining room, his breathing shallow and rapid. He stared at the folder as if it were a live explosive. He reached out with a shaking hand, grabbing the document and flipping open the cover. He read the first page. He read it again. The color leached completely from his face, leaving a sickly ashen gray. He dropped the folder onto the table, his legs giving way. He collapsed into the nearest chair, staring blankly at the wall, a man who had just watched his entire empire vaporize into dust. "What does it say?" Julian demanded, his voice cracking, edging toward hysteria. "Dad, what does it say?" Richard did not answer. He could not speak. I answered for him. "It says that Vanguard Holdings, LLC purchased the primary mortgage on this estate from your lenders 12 months ago," I explained, looking directly at Julian. "It says that Vanguard Holdings initiated formal foreclosure proceedings when you defaulted on your payments last quarter. And it says that Vanguard Holdings officially took possession of the deed 30 days ago." Beatrice stumbled forward, grabbing the edge of the table to steady herself. Her eyes were wild, darting between the document and my face. "Vanguard Holdings." Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling violently. "Who owns Vanguard Holdings?" I looked at the woman who had spent years treating me like an inferior species, who had proudly banished me to a concrete floor mere hours ago. "I do." "Beatrice," I replied softly, delivering the lethal blow with absolute precision. "I own Vanguard Holdings. I own the debt. I own the deed. You are currently standing in my dining room." The silence in the dining room stretched taut and fragile until Beatrice shattered it. She let out a harsh, ragged gasp, clutching the pearls at her throat. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and revulsion. The carefully maintained facade of the gracious society hostess crumbled entirely, revealing the vicious, class-obsessed snob beneath. "Where did you get that kind of money?" Beatrice shrieked, the volume of her voice startling the seated guests. "You are a foster kid. You grew up in group homes. You do not have millions of dollars to buy an estate." "This is a trick." I pulled out a heavy mahogany chair at the head of the table and sat down slowly. I smoothed the fabric of my gray wool dress, projecting an aura of complete, unbothered control. "I acquired the capital by doing exactly what I have always done, Beatrice," I replied, my voice steady, cutting through her hysteria. "I analyze distressed assets. I evaluate toxic debt. I find the rotting, unsustainable portfolios of people who spend money they do not have to impress people they do not like. And when their inevitable collapse occurs, I buy their wreckage at a steep discount." I gestured casually toward the lavish Thanksgiving spread covering the table. "You assumed my background made me weak," I continued, holding her panicked gaze. "You assumed growing up without a safety net meant I was desperate for your validation. You were wrong. Growing up in the system taught me how to survive without relying on anyone. It taught me how to read leverage, how to identify predators, and how to execute a flawless, hostile takeover. I bought your debt because your husband's financial negligence made it a highly profitable investment." Julian, who had been staring at the federal document in shock, finally snapped out of his paralysis. He lunged forward, snatching the folder from the table. He scanned the pages frantically, his eyes darting across the legal text, searching for a loophole, an error, any escape route. He found none. Vanguard Holdings, LLC. Julian muttered, his voice trembling as he read the designated owner line aloud. This is a shell company. You set up an anonymous LLC to buy our debt behind our backs. You orchestrated this entire thing just to steal my parents' house. I did not orchestrate your father's multi-million-dollar loan defaults, Julian, I stated coldly. I did not force him to leverage his entire retirement portfolio to fund your sister's European vacations. I merely purchased the paper he willingly signed when the bank decided his accounts were toxic. Caroline, who had remained quiet near the end of the table, suddenly stood up. The golden child, accustomed to having her every whim catered to, reacted with furious, petulant outrage. She picked up her crystal wine glass and hurled it onto the hardwood floor. The glass shattered, spraying dark red wine across the polished boards. "You are a thief!" Caroline screamed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "You are trying to steal our inheritance. I will call the police right now and have you arrested for extortion. We will sue you for everything you have. We will drag you through civil court until you are begging us for a settlement." I watched her tantrum with clinical detachment. "You cannot inherit debt." "Caroline," I replied smoothly, "your father is functionally bankrupt. The bank initiated the foreclosure proceedings 3 months ago. If Vanguard Holdings had not purchased the portfolio, federal marshals would have evicted you from this property last week. I did not steal your inheritance. I bought the burning building your father set on fire." Julian dropped the folder back onto the table. His expression shifted rapidly from panic to a calculating, desperate hostility. He saw his comfortable, subsidized life evaporating, and he reflexively sought a way to exploit the situation for his own gain. He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, tapping the screen aggressively. "You think you have won?" "Harper." Julian sneered, a desperate, ugly smirk twisting his features. "You think you can just swoop in, buy my family's debt through a shell company, and kick us out onto the street?" He held up his phone, displaying the contact list. "You forgot one minor detail." Julian continued, his voice dripping with triumphant malice. "We are still legally married. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state regarding marital assets. Any property or wealth you acquired during the course of our marriage, including this anonymous LLC and the assets it holds, is subject to division in a divorce settlement." He took a step closer to the table, brandishing the phone like a weapon. "I am calling a divorce attorney right now." Julian threatened, his eyes alight with greedy anticipation. "I will file for an emergency asset freeze tomorrow morning. The court will mandate an audit of Vanguard Holdings. I will claim 50% of the company's valuation, 50% of this estate, and 50% of your professional revenue. You tried to ruin my family, Harper, but you just bought me half a multi-million-dollar real estate portfolio. I will take half your empire and leave you with nothing." The guests in the dining room murmured nervously. Beatrice's tears stopped, instantly replaced by a sudden predatory hope. Richard looked up from his hands, a glimmer of aggressive defiance returning to his posture. They believed Julian had found the ultimate countermeasure. They believed they could use the sanctity of marriage to legally hijack the trap I had built for them. I did not panic. I did not attempt to negotiate. I sat back in the mahogany chair, interlaced my fingers, and waited for the final, devastating piece of the strategy to fall into place. I looked toward the shadowed hallway leading to the kitchen. "I do not think your divorce attorney will be very helpful in this particular scenario, Julian," I said softly. Julian scoffed, dialing a number on his phone. "We will see what the judge has to say about spouses hiding assets." A deep, resonant voice cut through the tension in the dining room, echoing from the hallway. "The judge will say that the assets are entirely protected under federal fraud exemptions, Julian." Marcus stepped out of the shadows. Marcus walked slowly into the dining room. He wore a dark, impeccably tailored suit, projecting an aura of calm, overwhelming authority. The quiet, observant brother-in-law, who usually sat at the periphery of family gatherings, silently enduring their subtle racist microaggressions and blatant condescension, now commanded the absolute center of the room. He carried a sleek black laptop under one arm and a thick-bound legal dossier in his free hand. Caroline stared at her husband, confusion warring with mounting panic. "Marcus," she stammered, her voice shrill. "What are you doing? Why are you defending her?" Marcus did not look at his wife. He kept his eyes locked firmly on Julian. He stopped near the head of the table, placing the laptop down and sliding the heavy dossier directly over the federal foreclosure documents I had provided. "Your divorce attorney will not be able to touch Vanguard Holdings." Julian Marcus stated, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded absolute attention. Vanguard Holdings is shielded by a federally recognized impenetrable firewall. Julian lowered his phone, the arrogant smirk replaced by a flicker of genuine apprehension. He recognized the tone. Marcus was a senior partner specializing in complex corporate tax law and forensic auditing. When Marcus spoke about financial structures, he spoke with lethal accuracy. "What are you talking about?" Julian demanded, attempting to maintain his aggressive posture. "We are legally married. The assets were acquired during the marriage. The law is clear." Marcus shook his head slowly, a grim, unyielding expression settling over his features. "The law is clear regarding marital assets acquired through legitimate joint enterprise," Marcus corrected him. "The law provides specific, robust exemptions when one spouse engages in targeted, malicious financial fraud against the other." Marcus tapped the cover of the dossier. "When you forged Harper's signature on the $500,000 commercial loan application for Chase Bank 12 months ago, you committed felony identity theft and bank fraud," Marcus explained, laying out the legal architecture of Julian's ruin with clinical precision. "You utilized her credit profile and independent assets to secure capital without her knowledge or consent." Beatrice gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Richard stared at his son in horror. The revelation of the forged loan was entirely new information to them. They knew Julian was helping manage the family debt, but they had no idea he had crossed the line into federal crime to accomplish it. "You cannot prove that," Julian shouted, his voice cracking, panic setting in. "You have no evidence." Marcus opened the dossier, flipping past the first several pages. "I am a forensic auditor, Julian. Gathering evidence is my profession." He retrieved a clear plastic sleeve containing a high-resolution copy of the original loan application and a secondary document filled with complex data logs. "I traced the origination metadata." Marcus continued presenting the documents to the table. The digital signature sequence was executed from an IP address registered to this estate on a Tuesday afternoon, a time when security records and client billing logs prove Harper was physically located in a commercial property 3 towns over. I also secured an independent handwriting analysis of the physical documents submitted to the bank. The analyst concluded with 99% certainty that the signature is a forgery. Julian staggered backward, hitting the edge of the dining room table. He stared at the documents, the blood draining completely from his face. The trap had not just sprung, it had crushed him. "Because you committed documented financial fraud against your spouse," Marcus explained, driving the final nail into the coffin, "your marriage entered a state of legal de facto separation the moment the crime occurred." Vanguard Holdings, LLC was incorporated in Wyoming strictly with funds Harper acquired prior to the marriage and capital secured from independent investors. Furthermore, federal statutes regarding asset protection shield victims of spousal fraud from equitable distribution claims. Marcus closed the dossier with a sharp, definitive snap. "You have absolutely no legal standing to claim a single penny of Vanguard Holdings. You try to take this to a divorce court, and the judge will not award you a settlement. The judge will refer your case directly to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. You cannot sue her for half her company, Julian. You are going to be too busy fighting a federal indictment." The silence in the dining room was profound. The devastating reality of Marcus's legal maneuver settled over the Sterling family. Julian had attempted to weaponize his marriage to steal my assets, only to discover that his own criminal actions had permanently immunized me against his claims. Richard, whose face had turned a mottled, dangerous red, suddenly stood up. He pointed a shaking finger at Marcus, his fury directed entirely at his son-in-law. "You traitor!" Richard roared, the veins in his neck bulging. "We welcomed you into this family. We gave you our daughter, and you conspire with this orphan to destroy us. You sit at our table, eat our food, and plot to steal our home." Marcus did not flinch. He stood tall, absorbing the racist, entitled venom Richard spewed without reacting emotionally. He looked at the patriarch of the Sterling family with profound, unadulterated pity. "I did not betray anyone." Richard Marcus replied, his voice remaining perfectly calm and professional. "I did exactly what my ethical obligations as a licensed forensic auditor and an officer of the court require me to do. I reported a federal crime." Marcus turned his gaze toward Caroline, who was staring at him with wide, tear-filled eyes, horrified by the realization that her husband had engineered her family's downfall. I watched you people treat Harper like a stray dog for years, Marcus said, addressing the entire room now. I watched you belittle her accomplishments, mock her background, and use her as a scapegoat for your own financial incompetence. I stayed quiet because I believed in maintaining peace for my wife's sake. He looked back at Julian. But when I discovered you were willing to send an innocent woman to federal prison to cover your gambling debts and failing business ventures, the peace was no longer worth maintaining. Marcus picked up his laptop and the heavy dossier. I am not the villain in your story, Richard Marcus stated, walking toward the exit of the dining room. I am just the accountant who finally audited the books. You destroyed yourselves. I merely filed the paperwork. Marcus walked out of the room, his footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving the Sterling family to face the catastrophic consequences of their own actions. The shield Julian relied upon had shattered, and the true extent of the financial carnage was about to be laid bare. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Marcus, sealing the remaining Sterling family members inside the opulent dining room. The silence that followed his departure was heavy, suffocating, and loaded with volatile kinetic energy. The illusion of unity, the carefully curated image of old money superiority they had projected for decades, had been violently stripped away. They were exposed bankrupt and facing federal scrutiny. The shock paralyzed them for a long moment, but panic is a powerful catalyst. When the realization of total ruin finally settled, the polite veneer shattered completely, giving way to primal, desperate self-preservation. Beatrice moved first. The gracious hostess persona vanished. Her face twisted into a mask of raw, visceral rage. She turned away from me and focused her fury entirely on her husband. She closed the distance between them in 3 rapid steps and delivered a vicious, open-palmed slap across Richard's face. The sharp crack echoed over the remains of the Thanksgiving feast. Several extended family members gasped, physically recoiling in their chairs. "You told me the credit lines were extended," Beatrice screamed, her voice shrill and abrasive, stripped of its usual cultured cadence. "You told me the business was experiencing a temporary liquidity issue. You mortgaged my home behind my back. You handed the deed to this creature." Richard stumbled back, his hand rising to touch his reddening cheek. The arrogant patriarch, humiliated in front of his siblings and business associates, retaliated with explosive anger. "Your home!" Richard roared, leaning forward, his physical size intimidating his wife. "You have not contributed a single dollar to this estate in 40 years. Do you have any idea how much capital it requires to maintain your ridiculous lifestyle? The country club fees, the charity galas, the constant remodeling. You bled my accounts dry to impress people who do not even like you." He gestured wildly toward Caroline, who was watching the confrontation with wide, terrified eyes. And Richard bellowed, his face a dark, dangerous purple. "You insisted on funding her boutique that has never turned a profit. You demanded we pay for her endless European vacations. I had to leverage the estate because you two refused to curb your pathological spending when the commercial real estate market contracted. You bankrupted us." Beatrice. The dining room descended into absolute chaos. The remaining guests, the aunts and uncles who had happily sipped champagne and mocked my banishment to the garage an hour ago, were now scrambling out of their chairs, desperate to distance themselves from the implosion. They gathered their coats, whispering frantically, abandoning the sinking ship without offering a single word of support. I remained standing at the head of the table, my arms crossed, watching the carnage. I did not intervene. I did not offer a defense. I allowed their inherent greed to do the work I could never accomplish with mere words. Julian, realizing his parents were entirely consumed by their mutual destruction, saw an opportunity to escape. He began edging toward the arched doorway leading to the kitchen, his eyes darting nervously toward the front hall. He needed to leave the premises before I contacted law enforcement regarding the forged commercial loan. He needed to run. He almost made it. Caroline, shaking from her father's aggressive reprimand, caught sight of Julian attempting to slip away. The fear in her eyes instantly transmuted into vicious survivalist anger. She remembered Marcus's forensic audit. She remembered the details of Julian's fraudulent maneuvers. She lunged across the room, intercepting Julian just as he reached the doorframe. She grabbed the lapels of his expensive cashmere sweater, yanking him backward with surprising strength. "Where do you think you are going?" Caroline shrieked, her manicured nails digging into the fabric. You used my name on the secondary auto loans, Julian Marcus told me. You purchased that vintage Porsche using my credit profile because yours was already maxed out. Julian tried to shove her away, his face pale with panic. Let go of me, Caroline. I had to secure the asset. I was going to flip the car to cover the margin calls you forged my signature. Caroline screamed, striking his chest with her fists. You tied my identity to a fraudulent loan. You are going to let the FBI arrest me to save yourself. I am not going to federal prison because you are a degenerate gambler who cannot run a business. Julian shoved her back harder this time, causing her to stumble and collide with a serving cart. Crystal glasses shattered against the hardwood floor. Shut up, Julian hissed, glancing nervously at me. I was trying to save the family. I did what I had to do. You did what you had to do to save yourself, Caroline retorted, bursting into tears, the reality of her impending criminal liability crashing down on her. You threw Harper under the bus, and when that failed, you used me. The elegant Thanksgiving dinner had devolved into a vicious, ugly brawl. The Sterling family, stripped of their wealth and their status, were violently tearing each other apart. The parents blamed each other for the financial ruin, while the siblings fought over the impending criminal charges. They possessed no loyalty, no honor, and no love for one another. They were united only by their shared narcissism, and when the resources ran dry, they cannibalized their own. I watched the man who had abandoned me in a freezing garage cower before his furious sister. I watched the woman who had mocked my foster care upbringing weep over her lost status. I watched the patriarch who had threatened my career crumble under the weight of his own financial incompetence. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to hurl insults or demand an apology. Their self-destruction was far more thorough and satisfying than any verbal reprimand I could deliver. I had simply presented the truth, and the truth had incinerated their entire existence. I uncrossed my arms and stepped forward, my shoes crunching softly against the broken crystal on the floor. I needed to conclude the evening and formally establish the new parameters of their reality. I had allowed them to tear each other apart long enough. It was time to deliver the final eviction notice. The volume in the dining room had reached a deafening crescendo. Richard and Beatrice were screaming over each other, their accusations blurring into a chaotic noise. Caroline was openly weeping, clutching the edge of the serving cart, while Julian desperately attempted to pry her hands off his ruined cashmere sweater. I picked up a heavy crystal water goblet from the table and slammed the heavy base down onto the polished mahogany wood. The sharp, resounding crack cut through the hysterical shouting like a gunshot. Quiet, I commanded, my voice projecting across the room with a cold, absolute authority that none of them had ever heard from me before. The physical shock of the noise, combined with the sudden commanding shift in my demeanor, forced them into an immediate stunned silence. They froze mid-argument, turning their heads to look at me. They were panting, their faces flushed, finally realizing that the woman they had invited to humiliate was the only person in the room who held any actual power. I looked at the four shattered individuals standing among the ruins of their Thanksgiving feast. I did not feel an ounce of pity. The internal disputes regarding who initiated the fraud are entirely irrelevant to me. I stated my tone clinical and detached, as if I were negotiating a corporate liquidation rather than evicting my in-laws. You are all equally complicit in the financial ruin of this estate. My only concern is securing the physical assets owned by Vanguard Holdings, LLC. I picked up the federal foreclosure document resting on the table and held it up. You have exactly 48 hours to vacate the premises, I announced, delivering the ultimatum with surgical precision. You are permitted to take your clothing, your personal electronics, and any sentimental items that hold zero resale value. Every piece of furniture, every piece of art, the imported rugs, the electronics, and the luxury vehicles parked in the driveway remain here. They are collateral against the defaulted loans, and they now belong to my company. Richard's mouth opened and closed silently. He stared at me, the reality of my decree finally penetrating his shock. 48 hours, he rasped, his voice trembling. Harper, be reasonable. We cannot organize a move in 2 days. We have nowhere to go. My credit lines are frozen. We need time to secure a rental. We need time to liquidate some minor assets to pay for movers. You do not have any minor assets left to liquidate, Richard reminded him sharply. And you exhausted my capacity for reason when you allowed your son to forge my signature on a federal banking document to cover your bad debts. The clock starts now. If you are still inside this house at 8 o'clock on Monday morning, I will not call a moving company. I will call the county sheriff and have you forcibly removed for trespassing." Beatrice stared at me, her eyes wide with mounting terror. The woman who had spent the last 3 years curating an image of untouchable elitism, who had orchestrated a smear campaign against my mental health to protect her social standing, suddenly realized the absolute totality of her defeat. The country club friends were gone, the bank accounts were empty, the mansion was lost, the pristine facade broke completely. Beatrice collapsed her knees, hitting the hardwood floor amid the scattered shards of broken crystal. She did not kneel in a dignified manner. She crumpled a pathetic, weeping heap of ruined velvet and pearls. She scrambled forward the fabric of her expensive dress, dragging across the floor until she reached my legs. She reached out with shaking hands and grabbed the hem of my gray wool dress. "Harper, please." Beatrice sobbed, tears ruining her immaculate makeup streaming down her face in dark streaks. "I am begging you, do not do this. We are old. Richard has a heart condition. We cannot survive on the street. We have no cash. Please show some mercy." She looked up at me, her expression contorted in absolute desperation. The woman who had sneered at my foster care upbringing was now literally groveling at my feet. "If you must take the house, let us stay on the property," Beatrice pleaded, her voice cracking, uttering a request so profoundly ironic it almost made me laugh. "Just for a few months. Until we figure something out. We will not bother you. We will stay out of your way. Please, Harper, let us sleep in the garage. We can set up a space heater. We will be quiet. Just do not throw us out in the cold." I looked down at her grasping hands. I remembered the biting cold of the concrete floor. I remembered the heavy click of the deadbolt locking me out of the warm house. I remembered her smug, satisfied smile as she told me a girl from the system should be accustomed to drafts. I did not yell. I did not kick her hands away. I simply reached down and deliberately, finger by finger, peeled her hands off my dress. I stepped back, forcing her to kneel unsupported on the floor. "The garage is currently designated as a holding area for the disposal of toxic commercial waste." "Beatrice, why?" I replied, my voice dropping to a smooth, icy whisper that chilled the room. "You do not meet the qualifications to occupy that space." I turned away from her sobbing form. I did not look at Richard. I did not acknowledge Julian or Caroline. I picked up my canvas overnight bag from the corner of the room. I walked out of the dining room, traversing the grand foyer with steady, measured steps. I reached the heavy mahogany front doors. I pulled the handle, opening the door to the cold, crisp November night air. I stepped onto the porch and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. The solid thud of the latch engaging echoed in the quiet night, permanently sealing the desperation, the ruin, and the weeping. Sterling family inside their former fortress. The execution was complete, but Julian's cowardly desperation was about to trigger the final, inescapable trap I had set for him. The heavy oak door shut, leaving the Sterling family to marinate in their new, destitute reality. I walked down the cobblestone path, the crisp night air biting at my cheeks. I did not drive back to the cheap motel. I drove to the secure, short-term apartment I had rented under the LLC's name. I slept soundly for the first time in weeks, knowing the financial guillotine had finally dropped. But I also knew Julian. Julian was a coward, and cowards do not stay and fight when the odds turn against them. They run. He knew the civil foreclosure was merely the opening salvo. Once I took possession of the estate and the corporate ledgers, I would possess uninhibited access to the physical evidence of his forged commercial loan. He assumed he had a brief window before I formally initiated criminal proceedings. He assumed wrong. The next morning, a weak, pale sun broke through the overcast sky. Inside the Sterling estate, the panic had likely mutated into frenzied action. While Richard and Beatrice were paralyzed by the sheer logistics of an impending eviction, Julian was executing his exit strategy. He knew his personal accounts and his joint accounts with me were either drained or flagged by the impending foreclosure. However, he also knew that Caroline, in her typical careless fashion, maintained a significant liquid cash reserve in a secondary savings account that had not yet been formally linked to the primary debt collapse. Julian slipped out of the mansion before his parents woke up. He took the keys to Caroline's leased Range Rover, avoiding his own vehicles, which were likely flagged for repossession. He needed cash untraceable and immediate to secure a flight out of the jurisdiction. At 9:15 in the morning, Julian walked through the glass doors of a large Chase Bank branch located 3 towns over from the estate, hoping the distance would provide an extra layer of security. He approached the teller counter, his usual polished swagger entirely absent. He wore sunglasses indoors, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a dark jacket. He kept his head down, sweating profusely despite the cool air conditioning inside the lobby. He slid Caroline's platinum debit card across the marble counter toward a young teller. "I need to execute a cash withdrawal," Julian said, his voice tight and rushed. "I need the daily maximum allowed, and I need to initiate a wire transfer for the remaining balance to an external account. I have the routing numbers here." He slid a folded piece of paper across the counter, detailing an offshore account in Belize. The teller took the card and swiped it through the terminal. She began typing on her keyboard, her eyes scanning the monitor. Julian tapped his foot impatiently against the tile floor, glancing nervously over his shoulder toward the main entrance. Every second he stood in the bank increased his exposure. The teller stopped typing. Her brow furrowed. She clicked the mouse a few times, a look of confusion crossing her face. "I am sorry, Mr. Sterling," the teller said, glancing up at him. "I cannot process this transaction." Julian's jaw tightened. "What do you mean you cannot process it? The funds are there. I checked the balance yesterday. Run it again." "I do not need to run it again, sir," the teller replied, her tone shifting from polite customer service to cautious hesitation. She leaned closer to the monitor, verifying the alert flashing across her screen in bold red text. "The system is blocking the withdrawal. This account has been flagged and formally frozen." "Frozen," Julian snapped, leaning over the counter, his panic spiking into anger. "On whose authority my sister owns this account? There is no lien on this money." The teller looked at him, her expression hardening. "It is not a bank-initiated lien, sir. The hold was placed early this morning by a federal mandate. The account is frozen pursuant to an active investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Julian froze. The blood drained from his face, leaving him a sickly pallid white. The FBI. He had expected a civil lawsuit from me. He had expected a protracted legal battle over the forged commercial loan that would take months to escalate into a criminal inquiry. He did not realize that while I was orchestrating the civil asset seizure, Marcus had been quietly compiling a separate, devastating dossier. Marcus had not just warned me about the impending transfer to the Shadow Syndicate. As a licensed corporate tax attorney, he possessed a legal obligation to report severe financial crimes. He had compiled the digital metadata tracing the forged signature, the IP logs confirming the origination of the fraudulent commercial loan, and the routing numbers linking Julian's actions directly to federal bank fraud. Marcus had submitted the entire package anonymously to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division 3 days prior. The federal agents did not wait for a civil foreclosure to conclude. They moved with swift, lethal efficiency. Julian backed away from the teller counter, leaving the platinum card sitting on the marble surface. His breath hitched in his throat. He turned around, his eyes darting frantically toward the glass doors of the bank lobby. He needed to get to the car. He needed to drive. He took 2 steps toward the exit. Through the large glass windows, Julian watched 2 black, unmarked SUVs pull aggressively into the bank's parking lot. The heavy vehicles angled sharply, blocking Caroline's Range Rover completely. The doors of the SUVs swung open in unison. 4 men and 1 woman stepped out. They wore dark tactical vests over plainclothes suits, the bright yellow letters FBI clearly visible across their chests. They moved with coordinated, purposeful speed, heading directly toward the bank entrance. Julian stopped dead in the middle of the lobby. His legs felt like lead. The escape route was sealed. The federal agents pushed through the revolving glass doors, their eyes scanning the interior of the bank. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a severe expression, spotted Julian standing frozen near the teller line. "Julian Sterling," the lead agent called out, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet bank, instantly drawing the attention of every customer and employee in the building. Julian did not answer. He slowly raised his hands, a gesture of absolute, terrified surrender. The agents closed the distance in seconds. 2 of them flanked Julian, grabbing his arms firmly and spinning him around to face the teller counter. They forced his hands behind his back. The harsh metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed through the lobby. "Julian Sterling, you are under arrest for federal bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud." The lead agent recited his voice, devoid of any emotion, performing a routine execution of duty. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Julian squeezed his eyes shut, tears of pure helpless terror leaking down his cheeks. He did not struggle. He did not shout for a lawyer. The golden boy who had spent his entire life shielded by his family's wealth and status, who had confidently forged his wife's signature to save his own skin, was finally facing a consequence his parents could not buy him out of. The agents marched him across the bank lobby, guiding him toward the exit. The customers watched in stunned silence as the impeccably dressed son of the prominent Sterling family was paraded out in handcuffs. They pushed Julian through the glass doors and out into the harsh morning light. They guided him toward the waiting SUV, pressing a hand down on his head as they folded him into the back seat. The heavy door slammed shut, sealing him inside the federal transport vehicle. The arrest was complete, swift, and publicly humiliating. The architect of the forgery was secured in federal custody, but the collateral damage inflicted upon the remaining Sterling family members was about to escalate into total social annihilation. Beatrice's desperate attempt to salvage her reputation was about to collide violently with the reality of her new destitute status. While Julian sat in a federal holding cell stripped of his belt and shoelaces, Beatrice Sterling refused to accept the reality of her eviction. The 48-hour deadline I issued was ticking down, and Richard was paralyzed by panic, frantically calling bankruptcy attorneys who demanded retainers he could no longer afford. Beatrice, however, operated on a different frequency. For her social standing was oxygen. She believed that if she could maintain the illusion of wealth, the reality of her poverty would somehow miraculously vanish. That evening, the Oak Ridge Country Club hosted its highly anticipated Autumn Charity Gala. It was the premier event of the season, a glittering assembly of the city's elite, the very people Beatrice had spent decades cultivating, impressing, and quietly despising. Beatrice dressed for battle. She wore a vintage Oscar de la Renta gown, fastened her heaviest diamond necklace around her throat, and applied her makeup with a heavy, desperate hand. She intended to walk into that gala project an aura of unshakable prosperity and quietly solicit a massive, unsecured personal loan from one of Richard's former business partners. She needed cash to hire a lawyer capable of challenging the foreclosure, and she believed her social capital was strong enough to secure it. She arrived at the club in an Uber, having been forced to leave her repossessed luxury sedan in the driveway of the estate she no longer owned. The entrance to the Oak Ridge Country Club was a grand affair flanked by marble columns and illuminated by gas lanterns. A red carpet led to a podium manned by the club manager, an impeccably dressed man named Arthur, who was flanked by two burly security guards in dark suits. Arthur held an iPad verifying the digital credentials of the arriving guests. Beatrice approached the podium, her chin held high, wearing a practiced, gracious smile. "Good evening, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. "A beautiful night for the gala, is it not?" She reached into her designer clutch and produced her Platinum VIP membership card, sliding it across the podium toward the scanner. Arthur did not smile back. He did not offer his usual obsequious greeting. He took the card, his expression carefully neutral, and swiped it through the terminal. A sharp, dissonant beep echoed from the machine. The screen flashed a bright, undeniable red. Beatrice frowned, a flicker of genuine annoyance breaking through her facade. "Run it again, Arthur," she instructed sharply, her tone shifting from gracious to demanding. "The magnetic strip must be dirty." Arthur did not run the card again. He placed it down on the podium, resting his hand over it. "I apologize, Mrs. Sterling." Arthur stated, his voice carrying the calm, detached professionalism of a man executing a highly unpleasant duty. "But your membership profile has been flagged. The executive committee formally revoked your membership privileges early this morning due to severe outstanding financial delinquencies spanning several quarters." Beatrice's face drained of color. The other guests arriving behind her paused, their conversations dying down as they realized a scene was unfolding. "That is impossible," Beatrice hissed, her voice dropping to a frantic whisper, desperate to contain the humiliation. "There must be a clerical error. Richard handles the club dues. I demand you let me inside to speak with the committee chairman immediately. I am afraid I cannot permit you to enter the premises," Mrs. Sterling Arthur replied, standing his ground. "The suspension is active. Furthermore, I have received specific instructions regarding the attendee list for tonight's gala." Beatrice glared at him, her chest heaving with rising panic. "Instructions from whom? I have been a platinum member of this club for 30 years. Who gave you instructions to bar me from a charity event?" Arthur looked past Beatrice, gazing through the large glass doors into the opulent main hall of the clubhouse. The instructions came directly from the primary benefactor of tonight's event. Arthur explained, his tone dropping a fraction of a degree in temperature. The new owner of the Vanguard Holdings portfolio made a highly generous, unsolicited donation of $500,000 to the club's philanthropic foundation this afternoon. Beatrice froze, the blood roaring in her ears. Vanguard Holdings. The name struck her like a physical blow. In light of her profound generosity, Arthur continued delivering the fatal strike with diplomatic precision. The executive committee granted her request to curate the final guest list. She specifically requested that individuals currently occupying properties in active foreclosure proceedings not be permitted to attend to avoid any unsavory disruptions. "We do not wish to offend our newest, most prominent benefactor." Beatrice turned her head slowly, her eyes wide with a horrific realization, looking through the heavy glass doors into the brightly lit grand hall. The gala was in full swing. Waiters circulated with silver trays. A string quartet played softly in the corner. In the very center of the room, occupying the primary VIP table reserved for the highest-tier donors, sat the new benefactor. I was wearing a sleek, tailored black evening gown, an outfit I purchased with the profits from my most recent distressed asset acquisition. I held a crystal flute of vintage champagne in my hand. I was engaged in polite conversation with the mayor and a prominent local judge, the very people Beatrice had hoped to exploit for a loan. I turned my head, looking directly through the glass doors. I met Beatrice's terrified, humiliated gaze. I did not sneer. I did not offer a victorious smirk. I simply raised my champagne glass a fraction of an inch, offering a silent, lethal toast to her absolute destruction before turning my attention back to the judge. Beatrice let out a strangled, breathless sound. The woman who had banished me to a concrete floor, who had spread vicious rumors about my mental health, was now locked outside in the cold, staring through the glass at the empire I had seamlessly conquered. The guests waiting in line behind her began to murmur the whispers of gossip spreading like wildfire. They saw the red light on the scanner. They saw Arthur refusing her entry. They realized the formidable Beatrice Sterling was bankrupt and actively being turned away at the door. "Ma'am," one of the security guards stepped forward, his voice gruff and authoritative. "I need to ask you to step aside and clear the entrance for the invited guests. If you refuse to leave the property, we will be forced to escort you to the street." Beatrice looked at the guard, then back at the glittering ballroom she could no longer enter. The reality of her exile crashed down upon her, crushing the last remnants of her arrogance. She had no money, she had no status, she had no home. She was nothing but a spectacle for her former friends to pity and mock. She turned away from the podium, her shoulders slumped, the heavy diamond necklace suddenly looking like a garish costume piece. She walked down the red carpet alone, moving past the line of arriving luxury vehicles, her head bowed in total public disgrace. The 48-hour eviction clock was ticking down its final minutes, and the legal reckoning awaiting her family in the courtroom was preparing to strip away whatever dignity they had left. The crisp autumn chill gave way to the biting cold of a deep January winter by the time the legal machinery ground its way to the final crushing conclusion. I sat in the polished wooden pew of the federal courthouse wearing a tailored navy suit, my posture relaxed and observant. I was not there as a defendant. I was there as the primary creditor, the defrauded spouse, and the executioner. The courtroom felt sterile, smelling faintly of lemon cleaner and stale coffee. The gallery was sparsely populated with a few bored legal clerks and a lone journalist from a local financial blog. The heavy side door opened, and Julian was escorted into the room by 2 federal marshals. The physical transformation was staggering. The arrogant, impeccably groomed businessman who had sneered at me from the comfort of his parents' mansion was gone. Julian wore an ill-fitting bright orange jumpsuit. His skin was sallow, his hair unkempt, his shoulders hunched in perpetual defeat. 3 months in a federal holding facility stripped of his bespoke suits and his family's protective wealth had reduced him to a terrified, shivering shell. He sat down heavily at the defense table, his wrists bound by heavy steel chains secured to a belly chain. He did not look at me. He stared at the scratched wooden table, his chest heaving with silent, frantic breaths. Richard sat 2 tables over, representing himself in the civil bankruptcy proceedings, having been unable to secure a defense attorney without an upfront retainer. He looked aged, the stress carving deep, permanent lines into his face. He avoided making eye contact with Julian. The alliance of convenience between father and son had disintegrated entirely under the pressure of impending incarceration. The presiding judge, a stern woman with a reputation for merciless efficiency in financial fraud cases, called the hearing to order. The docket combined the finalization of my divorce petition, the civil liability assessment for the forged commercial loan, and the formal declaration of bankruptcy for Richard and Beatrice Sterling. The judge addressed Julian first, leaning forward, her gaze piercing through her reading glasses. "Mr. Sterling," the judge began, her voice echoing in the quiet room, "you are facing severe federal charges for wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. You utilized your spouse's identity to secure a fraudulent commercial loan, subsequently funneling the capital into a failing business venture operated by your father. Do you have anything to say before I issue my ruling on the civil liabilities associated with these actions?" Julian stood up slowly, the chains rattling against the table. He looked at the judge, tears welling in his hollow eyes. He was desperate, willing to incinerate any remaining bridge to secure a fraction of leniency. "Your Honor," Julian pleaded, his voice cracking a pathetic, reedy sound, "I take full responsibility for signing the document, but I was coerced. I was manipulated." He turned, pointing a trembling, shackled finger directly at Richard. "My father forced me to do it," Julian shouted, his voice echoing shrilly across the courtroom. "He told me the family business was collapsing. He said if I did not secure the bridge loan using Harper's credit, he would lose the estate. He provided the notary stamp. He structured the offshore transfers. I did not know how to execute the wire fraud. He orchestrated the entire operation and used me as a shield." A collective murmur rippled through the few people in the gallery. Richard's head snapped up. He stared at his son, his mouth open in stunned, horrified disbelief. The golden child, the son he had compromised his entire moral compass to protect, was actively testifying against him in open court, begging the judge to transfer the bulk of the federal sentence onto his own father. Richard slowly lowered his head until his forehead rested against the cold wood of the defense table. He did not object. He did not argue. The betrayal broke the last remaining pillar of his resistance. He sat there, a ruined, destitute man, publicly destroyed by the son he had raised to be just as ruthless as he was. The judge slammed her gavel, silencing Julian's frantic accusations. "That is enough, Mr. Sterling," the judge commanded sharply. "Your attempts to mitigate your own culpability by shifting blame are noted, but they do not erase the fact that your signature is on the fraudulent origination file. Your criminal sentencing will be handled in a separate federal proceeding. However, regarding the civil matters before this court today, the evidence is irrefutable." The judge picked up a stack of documents, the comprehensive financial reports compiled by Marcus and my own legal team. The court finds that Harper Quinn was the victim of targeted, malicious financial fraud executed by her spouse. The judge declared her tone, leaving zero room for appeal. The court hereby grants the petition for divorce effective immediately. Furthermore, the court rules that all assets currently held by Vanguard Holdings, LLC, were acquired post-separation, using independent, uncompromised capital. These assets are entirely shielded from any equitable distribution claims. Julian Sterling holds zero legal right to any property revenue or business interests managed by Harper Quinn. The judge turned her attention to the second legal matter, the judgment carrying a heavy punitive weight. In addition to the asset protection, the judge continued looking severely at Julian. The court orders Julian Sterling to pay complete restitution for the emotional distress and financial jeopardy inflicted upon the plaintiff. A judgment of $1 million is entered against the defendant payable to Harper Quinn. Julian slumped back into his chair, burying his face in his bound hands, sobbing openly. The judgment was purely symbolic. He had no money to pay it. But the financial lien would remain attached to his name permanently, ensuring that if he ever managed to earn a single dollar after his release from prison, it would immediately be garnished and transferred to my accounts. I was legally permanently tethered to the debt he tried to force onto me. The judge turned her gaze toward Richard, who remained motionless, his head still resting on the table. Regarding the petition for Chapter 7, bankruptcy filed by Richard and Beatrice Sterling, the judge stated, reviewing a separate file. The court has reviewed the asset forfeiture logs executed by the federal marshals. The primary estate, the luxury vehicles, and the commercial portfolios have been seized and liquidated by the primary creditor, Vanguard Holdings. The judge paused, her voice devoid of any sympathy for the fallen patriarch. The court formally approves the bankruptcy petition. You are entirely insolvent, Mr. Sterling. The remaining unsecured debts are discharged, but the federal tax liabilities incurred through your fraudulent shell companies remain active. You and your wife will be required to establish a payment plan with the Internal Revenue Service immediately. The gavel struck the block one final time. We are adjourned. I gathered my coat and my leather briefcase, standing up from the plaintiff's table. I did not feel a sudden surge of vindictive joy. I felt a profound, heavy sense of closure. The infection had been surgically removed. The legal system had sterilized the wound. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels echoing sharply in the quiet hallway. As I approached the exit, I saw Beatrice standing near the security checkpoint. She had not been permitted inside the courtroom during the proceedings, relegated to waiting in the drafty corridor. She looked frail, wrapped in a cheap synthetic winter coat that poorly mimicked the designer wool she used to wear. The heavy makeup could not hide the deep, exhausted lines etched into her face. She watched me approach, her eyes filled with a complex mixture of fear and simmering, impotent resentment. The woman who had proudly directed me to sleep in a freezing garage was now staring at a future devoid of any comfort or security. I did not stop to speak to her. I did not offer a condescending smile or a final biting remark. Engaging with her would imply she still held some relevance in my life. I simply walked past her, my gaze fixed straight ahead, treating her with the absolute chilling indifference she had shown me for years. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped out into the freezing January air, leaving the Sterling family to navigate the bleak, desolate reality they had built for themselves. The legal battles were concluded, but the final necessary severing of the lingering emotional ties was about to arrive in the form of a pathetic, desperate phone call from the one person who still mistakenly believed she could exploit my history. The deep winter freeze settled over the city, turning the streets into slick gray corridors. 3 weeks had passed since the civil rulings finalized the destruction of the Sterling family's assets. I sat in my home office, a space I had recently renovated, the smell of fresh paint and new leather replacing the stale anxiety that used to haunt my evenings. I was reviewing a prospectus for a new portfolio of distressed commercial debt, my mind focused entirely on the future. My personal cell phone vibrated against the mahogany desk, shattering the quiet focus of the room. I glanced at the screen. The caller ID displayed an unknown number with a local area code. I rarely answered unknown calls, preferring to let them route to voicemail, but a faint, cynical intuition compelled me to swipe the green icon. "Hello," I answered, keeping my tone crisp and professional. A sharp, ragged intake of breath echoed through the speaker, followed by a wet, pathetic sniffle. "Harper," the voice whispered, trembling and small. "Is that you? Please do not hang up." I recognized the voice instantly, despite the dramatic shift in its usual arrogant cadence. It was Caroline, the golden child, the sister who had proudly flaunted her diamond tennis bracelet while actively participating in my banishment to the freezing garage. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring out the window at the dark street below. I did not offer a greeting. I waited, forcing her to endure the heavy, uncomfortable silence, making her carry the full weight of her desperation. "Harper, I know you hate me." Caroline sobbed, her voice breaking into a frantic, breathless plea. "I know I was awful to you. I am so sorry. I really am. But I have nowhere else to turn. Marcus will not answer my calls. My parents are living in a tiny apartment, and they do not have a single dollar to spare." She paused, taking another ragged, wet breath. I could hear the ambient noise of a busy street in the background, the rumble of traffic, and the distant wail of a siren. She was calling from a payphone or a borrowed cell standing outside in the bitter cold. "Please, Harper." Caroline begged, the last remnants of her pride disintegrating completely. "I need help. My accounts are still frozen by the FBI investigation. My landlord just taped a 3-day eviction notice to my apartment door. I do not have money for groceries. I do not have money for gas. Can you please loan me $1,000 just until I figure things out? I will pay you back with interest. I swear." I listened to the desperate pleading litany. I closed my eyes, recalling the image of Caroline standing in the grand foyer of the Sterling estate. I remembered her smug, condescending smile as Beatrice handed me the deflated air mattress. I remembered the cold, dismissive look in her eyes as I dragged my canvas bag toward the dark, unheated garage, knowing full well she was sleeping in a plush, heated guest suite funded by money her brother had stolen using my identity. She had reveled in my humiliation. She had actively participated in my targeted isolation. She had treated my lack of family as a weapon to bludgeon my self-worth. And now, stripped of her stolen wealth and her enabling parents, she expected the very woman she had tormented to provide a financial safety net. I opened my eyes, the cold, clinical detachment solidifying within me. I felt zero empathy. Empathy is a resource reserved for victims of circumstance, not architects of cruelty. Caroline. I began, my voice perfectly level, devoid of any anger or gloating. It was the voice of a professional delivering a finalized business decision. I am not a charity, and I am certainly not a bank extending unsecured credit to individuals with a demonstrated history of severe financial negligence. But I am going to be on the street, Caroline shrieked, the panic escalating into hysteria. I have never been homeless. I do not know how to survive out here. You will adapt, I replied smoothly. You are an adult. The protective bubble your father funded through embezzlement has popped. It is time for you to enter the real world. I heard a sharp, devastated sob echo through the speaker. She had assumed my history in the foster system had instilled a sense of bleeding heart compassion that she could manipulate. She assumed wrong. There is a coffee shop 3 blocks from the federal courthouse, I suggested, offering a piece of practical, devastatingly condescending advice. I noticed a sign in their window yesterday. They are actively hiring a janitorial assistant for the closing shift. The pay is minimum wage, but it provides a steady paycheck and a warm place to stand for a few hours. I recommend you apply tomorrow morning before someone else takes the position. Harper, you cannot be this cruel. Caroline wailed, her desperation turning into a vicious, cornered anger. You have millions. $1,000 is nothing to you. You are a monster. You are confusing cruelty with consequences, Caroline, I stated, finalizing the conversation. You spent your entire life mocking the people who had to work for their survival. Welcome to the working class. I did not wait for a response. I pressed the red button ending the call, severing the connection with absolute finality. I opened the phone settings and permanently blocked the unknown number, ensuring she could never reach me from that line again. I set the phone down on the mahogany desk. I picked up my pen and returned my attention to the commercial debt prospectus resting in front of me. The chapter was closed. The Sterling family was nothing more than a localized, fading memory. It was time to execute the final symbolic gesture of eradication, a physical dismantling of the primary monument to their arrogance, clearing the ground for the empire I intended to build. The sharp, diesel-scented exhaust of heavy machinery hung thick in the cold February air. I stood on the sidewalk opposite the sprawling Beacon Hill estate, my hands shoved deep into the pockets of my wool coat. The sky was an unbroken expanse of slate gray, promising freezing rain by mid-afternoon. Behind the wrought iron gates, 3 massive yellow excavators idled on the once pristine, manicured lawn. Their heavy steel treads churned the dormant grass into dark, muddy ruts. I had not listed the property for resale. I possessed no desire to flip the Sterling mansion for a quick profit, nor did I want another wealthy family moving in to inherit the toxic architecture of Richard and Beatrice's arrogance. The structure itself felt infected. I had filed the demolition permits the moment the bankruptcy judge finalized the asset transfer. I intended to erase it from the map entirely. I watched the foreman signal the lead excavator operator. The massive diesel engine roared, sending a plume of black smoke into the gray sky. The machine lurched forward, its articulated arm raising a heavy steel bucket high above the roofline. I sensed movement in my peripheral vision, standing on the opposite corner of the intersection, shivering in thin winter coats that offered little protection against the biting wind, were Richard and Beatrice. They stood huddled together, their faces pale and drawn, watching the staging area with expressions of profound, shell-shocked devastation. They had received this public notice regarding the demolition, and a macabre, masochistic curiosity had apparently drawn them out of their subsidized apartment to witness the final execution of their legacy. I did not turn to face them. I did not offer a victorious wave or a gloating smile. I simply stood my ground, my posture relaxed, allowing them to observe my total unbothered control over the situation. The excavator's steel bucket swung forward, crashing violently into the second-story facade. The sound was thunderous. Brick mortar and expensive imported Italian marble shattered instantly under the immense force. A thick cloud of gray dust erupted from the impact zone, billowing outward and coating the surrounding oak trees. The machine pulled back, dragging the heavy bucket downward, ripping a massive, jagged hole directly through the master bedroom, where Beatrice had spent years orchestrating her social campaigns. The excavator struck again this time, tearing through the grand formal dining room. The very room where Richard had delivered his pompous Thanksgiving toast, the exact location where I had dropped the federal foreclosure documents onto the mahogany table. The crystal chandelier visible through the shattered bay windows crashed to the floor in a shower of glittering shards before the ceiling caved in, entirely burying it under tons of debris. I watched the walls collapse, crumbling into a chaotic, pulverized mound of rubble. I did not feel a sudden euphoric rush of vindictive triumph. The adrenaline that had fueled my strategy for the past year had burned out, replaced by a deep, resonant calm. The house was just a building. Tearing it down was merely the final administrative task required to clear the ledger. The ghosts of the Sterling family's cruelty, the echoes of their mocking laughter in the freezing garage, were being systematically crushed into dust. A dark sedan pulled up to the curb a few feet from where I stood. The engine idled quietly. The passenger door opened, and Marcus stepped out. He wore a tailored overcoat projecting his usual aura of sharp, analytical composure. He walked over and stood beside me, his hands resting in his pockets as he observed the demolition. He held out a steaming paper cup. I took it, the warmth of the coffee seeping into my cold fingers. The structural integrity was severely compromised anyway, Marcus remarked dryly, his gaze fixed on the excavator tearing through the grand foyer. It is a fitting metaphor for the family that occupied it. I took a slow sip of the dark roast coffee. I heard from Silas Thorne that the federal prosecutors formally denied Julian's final appeal for a sentence reduction this morning, I stated, keeping my voice level. The 15-year sentence stands. Marcus nodded, his expression grim but satisfied. He earned every day of it. Caroline attempted to contact me yesterday regarding spousal support during the divorce proceedings. I informed her legal counsel that my forensic audit of her personal spending habits would be submitted as evidence of financial complicity if she pursued the claim. She withdrew the petition within the hour. I looked across the intersection. Richard and Beatrice were turning away from the spectacle, their shoulders slumped, their gait slow and unsteady. They shuffled down the cold sidewalk, two ruined elderly individuals returning to a bleak, impoverished reality they had engineered entirely by their own actions. They disappeared around the corner, fading from view permanently. "You executed a flawless liquidation," Harper Marcus said quietly, turning to look at me. "You dismantled a highly organized fraud ring and recovered the stolen assets without leaving a single legal vulnerability for them to exploit." I watched the excavator blade crush the remaining frame of the garage, burying the concrete floor under a mountain of shattered brick and splintered wood. The physical space where they had attempted to break my spirit no longer existed. "I just balanced the books," Marcus, I replied, offering a faint, resolved smile. "They generated the toxic debt. I simply collected the payment." The demolition crew moved into the next phase of the operation, the heavy machinery roaring as it began to clear the massive pile of debris. The site was being prepped for the foundational work of the new enterprise. The ruins of the past were officially cleared, and the blueprint for the future was ready for deployment. 6 months passed. The humid July heat rippled above the fresh asphalt of the private access road. Where a decaying symbol of inherited arrogance and fraudulent wealth once stood a striking structure of reinforced steel and tinted glass, now pierced the suburban skyline. The silver lettering mounted near the automated security gates caught the morning sun, reflecting a brilliant, undeniable light. Vanguard Enterprises. I stood in my top-floor executive suite looking down at the world through expansive floor-to-ceiling windows. My office occupied the exact geographic coordinates where the unheated concrete garage used to sit. The poetic symmetry of that fact provided a quiet, enduring satisfaction that no amount of monetary profit could replicate. The air inside my suite smelled of fresh espresso and expensive leather, a permanent upgrade from the scent of gasoline and damp cardboard that had marked my lowest point. My firm had not merely survived the initial turbulence of acquiring the Sterling portfolio. It thrived, expanding into a formidable asset management corporation. We specialized in identifying rotting corporate structures, purging the toxic elements, and rebuilding them into highly profitable, streamlined operations. The industry recognized us as predators, and we wore the title as a badge of honor. The glass door of my office slid open with a soft pneumatic hiss. Marcus walked in holding a sleek digital tablet. He had resigned from his previous law firm shortly after the federal raid, recognizing that working alongside me offered a far more lucrative and ethically transparent environment. He now served as the chief financial officer of Vanguard Enterprises, bringing his unparalleled forensic auditing skills to our daily acquisitions. He placed the tablet on my desk. The screen displayed a real-time financial readout of our latest target, a struggling commercial logistics company operating out of Chicago. They rejected our initial buyout offer. Marcus stated, his tone businesslike and precise. Their board of directors believes they can secure bridge funding to avoid our takeover. They think we are bluffing about calling in their outstanding loans. I turned away from the window and walked to my desk. I reviewed the numbers scrolling across the screen. The logistics company was bleeding capital, relying on outdated infrastructure and desperate accounting maneuvers to hide their insolvency. Their board consisted of men who shared the same arrogant, entitled DNA as Richard Sterling. They believed they could dictate terms and intimidate a younger female investor into backing down. They are operating under a severe miscalculation, I replied, my voice steady and clinical. Execute the secondary strategy. Contact their primary supply chain vendors. I want to purchase their outstanding accounts receivable by noon. Once we hold their operational debt, we will freeze their supply lines. Let us see how long their board of directors holds out when their delivery trucks cannot purchase fuel. Marcus offered a sharp, knowing smile. The contracts are already drafted. I will wire the funds and initiate the freeze immediately. They will be begging us to accept their surrender before the market closes today. He turned and walked out of the office, his footsteps echoing with confident purpose. I watched him leave, appreciating the seamless efficiency of a team built on mutual respect and shared competence, rather than obligatory bloodlines. A soft chime sounded from my desktop computer. A secure video feed popped up on my secondary monitor. Mrs. Gable, working remotely from her Victorian home across the city, served as our lead digital security consultant. She monitored our corporate network with the same fierce, unblinking vigilance she once applied to her neighborhood porch. The feed displayed a brief encrypted text message. Perimeter secure. No unauthorized access attempts detected. The firewall upgrades are functioning flawlessly. Enjoy your morning coffee, boss. I smiled, typing a quick note of gratitude. I had surrounded myself with apex predators who operated with unwavering loyalty. We did not need performative family dinners or country club memberships to validate our worth. We let our profit margins and our flawless execution do the talking. My desk phone rang. It was the receptionist in the main lobby downstairs. She informed me that a man named Gregory Pierce was requesting an unscheduled meeting. The name registered instantly. Gregory was a prominent real estate developer and a former close associate of Richard Sterling. I was one of the men who had sat in the country club dining room laughing at Beatrice's fabricated stories about my mental health. "Send him up," I instructed. 5 minutes later, Gregory Pierce stepped into my office. He did not possess the swagger I remembered. He looked haggard, his suit slightly wrinkled, his posture carrying the heavy burden of impending financial ruin. He took a seat across from my desk, clasping his hands together nervously. Harper Gregory began forcing a tight, uncomfortable smile. "It is remarkable what you have built here. Truly impressive. I did not offer him a beverage. I did not return his smile. I waited in silence, forcing him to navigate the awkwardness of his own desperation. I find myself in a difficult liquidity position. Gregory continued, clearing his throat. The commercial real estate market is contracting. I have a balloon payment due on a major downtown development next week, and my traditional lenders are hesitant to extend further credit. I know Vanguard handles distressed assets. I was hoping we could negotiate a short-term bridge loan. I am willing to offer highly favorable interest rates. I pulled up his public financial filings on my monitor, scanning the data with practiced speed. You do not need a bridge loan, Gregory, I stated, my voice stripping away any pretense of social courtesy. Your development is over-leveraged, your contractors are filing liens for unpaid invoices, and your primary anchor tenant just pulled out of their lease agreement. You are not facing a liquidity issue. You are facing imminent bankruptcy. Gregory flushed, his pride warring with his desperation. I can turn it around. I just need capital to finish the construction phase. I am not a charity, I replied, leaning back in my chair. I do not fund sinking ships. However, Vanguard is willing to purchase the distressed development from your portfolio. We will offer you 20 cents on the dollar for the deed. It will provide you with enough liquid cash to pay off your immediate creditors and avoid personal bankruptcy, but you will forfeit all future revenue and ownership rights to the project. 20 cents on the dollar. Gregory gasped, his eyes wide with indignation. That is robbery. The projected valuation of that building is worth triple that amount. The projected valuation relies on completion, which you cannot finance, I countered flawlessly. You have 48 hours to accept the buyout offer before your contractors initiate foreclosure proceedings and you lose the property for nothing. The contract will be waiting with my legal team downstairs. Gregory stared at me, realizing he had walked into a slaughterhouse seeking a lifeline. He saw the cold, unyielding reality in my eyes. I was not the quiet, submissive girl he used to mock. I was the executioner of his financial legacy. He stood up slowly, defeated, and walked out of the office without another word. He would sign the contract by tomorrow. He had no other choice. I stood up from my desk and walked back to the expansive window. I looked out over the city limits, watching the distant highways teeming with morning commuters. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The suffocating gray fog that used to characterize my existence had permanently lifted. The local business journals had recently published an extensive profile on Vanguard Enterprises, dubbing us the most formidable new firm in the state. They marveled at our rapid ascent, speculating on the immense hidden backing we must possess. They did not know the truth. They did not understand that the ultimate foundation for an unstoppable empire is forged in the fires of profound betrayal. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the warmth settle in my chest. Toxic families always operate under a singular catastrophic delusion. They think you need them to survive. They use kinship as a heavy iron chain, expecting you to drag their failures, their insecurities, and their debts without ever uttering a single complaint. They demand infinite grace while offering nothing but conditional transactional affection. They rely on your emotional vulnerability to maintain their unearned authority. But when you stop crying over the love they refuse to give, everything changes. When you stop seeking their validation and start reading the terms and conditions of the life they are forcing you to live, the power dynamic shifts permanently. You will realize a profound, undeniable truth. The individual holding the power in any relationship is not the one who yells the loudest. It is not the one who holds the most prestigious country club membership, and it is certainly not the one who demands the most respect. The person holding the power is the one holding the final financial statement. Do not waste your energy seeking closure from people who are committed to misunderstanding you. Do not beg for a seat at a table where you are treated like an afterthought. And never under any circumstances forgive those who attempt to banish you to the garage. Let them keep their hollow titles and their rotting estates. You take your skills, you gather your evidence, and you quietly secure your own capital. You buy the whole neighborhood and you build a luxury hotel right on top of their shattered foundation. The view from the penthouse is always better when you own the building. I stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my executive suite, watching the morning traffic weave through the concrete arteries of the city. The sun reflects off the glass skyline, bright and piercing. The Sterling family is a closed file buried under federal indictments and bankruptcy proceedings, but the blueprint of their destruction remains etched in my mind. Looking back at the empire I built from the ashes of their betrayal, I carry 3 distinct lessons that now govern my life. First, silence is your most lethal weapon. Toxic individuals thrive on your emotional exhaustion. They want you to scream, defend, and negotiate because noise creates confusion. I learned to trade my anger for quiet observation. When you stop arguing, you start collecting. Let them spin their elaborate lies at country club luncheons, while you quietly gather the bank statements, the property deeds, and the security footage. You do not need to convince a liar that they are lying. A meticulously curated paper trail never loses a debate. Second, a title is not a binding contract for perpetual abuse. Society conditions us to tolerate betrayal simply because we share a bloodline or a wedding band. We are told to keep the peace and honor the family unit. But peace built on your subjugation is just a hostage situation. The moment Julian forged my signature to protect his parents' failing status, my marriage ceased to be a partnership. It became a severe financial liability. Your ultimate loyalty must always belong to your own survival. You possess the sovereign right to cut ties with anyone who views your existence as a disposable resource. Third, true power is never bestowed. It is acquired. You do not wait for arrogant people to suddenly realize your worth or offer you a seat at their mahogany table. You step out of their house, you build your own capital in the shadows, and you wait for the inevitable moment their ego outpaces their cash flow. When their house of cards collapses, you do not offer a hand to pull them up. You buy the very ground beneath their feet, and you evict them from the narrative. I turn away from the window and walk back to my desk. The market is opening, new distressed portfolios are waiting to be audited, and Vanguard Enterprises has fresh acquisitions to finalize. The freezing concrete floor of that garage feels like a different lifetime. I am no longer the discarded wife. I am the architect of my own reality. If my journey gave you the blueprint to draw your own uncompromising boundaries, leave a comment below and share how you took your power back. Please like, subscribe, and tune in to Hazel Tells Stories for more narratives about rewriting the rules and leaving the creators of your pain in the dust. Stay sharp, guard your peace.